Tonight on Bridge City News, the federal government stress test is in fact causing a lot of young homebuyers stress in Lethbridge. We have the details. UCP leader Jason Kenney is considering legal action against a former UCP member. We will explain why. And we have the reaction from Parliament Hill following the testimony of Justin Trudeau's former Principal Secretary Gerald Butts on the SNC-Lavalin affair. Thanks so much for joining us. UCP leader Jason Kenney says he may sue a former colleague for defamation over accusations Kenney cheated to win his party's leadership contest. Kenney's lawyers have sent a letter to former UCP member Prab Gill ordering him to stop making the claims. Kenney says Gill's accusations have no merit and smear the entire party. In February, Gill sent the RCMP a letter saying he believes Kenney's team may have committed criminal fraud by redirecting thousands of voting passwords to offshore sites to ensure those votes went to Kenney. Gill is now sitting as an independent for the Calgary Greenway constituency. One of the big issues heading into the provincial election this spring is the carbon tax, and how Premier Rachel Notley was so quick to agree to the federal Liberals' tax. Robert Murphy is a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute, and he says the tax is not helping to reduce carbon emissions, especially on the global scale, where Canada's carbon footprint is so small.
Canada by itself, the figures I checked, it's something like 1.6 or 1.5% of total global emissions. So even if Canada tomorrow went to zero emissions, in the grand scheme, that wouldn't make much of a difference, let alone the small changes that are coming in place from modest carbon taxes. So the quick answer to your question is it's causing a lot of economic pain without very much to show for it, just because, again, Canada is such a small player and this problem of leakage.
Catch the full interview with Mr. Murphy as he discusses the burden of the carbon tax on Albertans. That's coming up right after business news. If you've driven past City Hall in the last couple of months, you may have noticed protesters wearing yellow vests. The movement initially started in France and has made its way to Canada to protest the carbon tax, and what the group calls politicians who have the audacity to sell our country's sovereignty over to the globalist UN and their tyrannical policies.
Well, I think, every time there is a downturn in the oil economy in Alberta, you see this rise. So we've seen it during the 1980s, the early 1990s, again in the last few years. So those are legitimate concerns about what kind of economy we have right now and where the jobs are going to be in future. I think that's a legitimate discussion to have. But it's very easy for people who are concerned about that to kind of go off on tangents. And it's not clear here how this fits into a broader kind of social and political discussion about where is Alberta and where does our future actually lie here. And those are the bigger questions to be addressed.
The group has more than 110,000 members on its Facebook page. Many people in southern Alberta have been complaining about how bad the real estate market really is. It is definitely a buyer's market right now. A new report by the Building Industry and Land Development Association and the Lethbridge and District Association of Realtors says the stress test brought in by the feds last year is still having a major impact on home buyers.
As sad as it is, unfortunately, that statistic in Lethbridge, I think, is probably stronger than some other places across the province right now, just because you guys are a little bit more diversified than maybe some of the other areas. No population is more affected by this than the young potential homebuyers that are out there in our market. Not necessarily focusing just on southern Alberta, but in the province as a whole, we have seen the housing sales volume at its lowest point since 2010, despite our population growing by more than 500,000 people in the last 8 years. And it's sad that, people have lost that dream. That statement and that statistic is really hard for me to get past. That, it's not just that they've delayed their dream. At this point, the statistics are saying they have given up on the dream.
Home buyers in Lethbridge saw their purchasing power decrease by 17.3% and an additional 5.5% due to rising interest rates. The 60s scoop, when the government forced Indigenous children into residential schools, has now been linked to serious health consequences for survivors. Researcher Kat Chief Moon Riley, who conducted the research for her Master of Science thesis, says the traumatic experience may have caused impacts that may go beyond the mind, not only among those who attended the schools, but later among their own children.
Kat Chief Moon Riley came in as she was a neuroscience student And then she approached me with an interest in a master's degree. Really interested in residential school. It's also a social experience. And so we brought her on as a research coordinator and as a Master's of Science student. And then she really expressed this interest in, well, why don't we look at residential school and the impacts of that on health as a social, that experience. And so her input for the research project was really important.
The research, published in the journal SSM Population Health, found that adult children of mothers who attended residential schools had increased impairment in biological regulation compared to those mothers who had not attended residential schools. Lethbridge police need our help. They're looking for 28-year-old Jared Bruce Healy. He's wanted in connection with the stabbing last Tuesday in the Westside Trailer Court. Healy faces a wide variety of charges, including aggravated assault. If you've seen Healy, call Crime Stoppers right away at 1-800-222-8477. March is Fraud Prevention Month. The Lethbridge Police have been going door to door to local businesses, handing out CRA fraud prevention cards. Thousands of Canadians, including many seniors, have been the victims of scams which say if you don't pay with iTunes cards or prepaid credit cards, the cops will come to your door. The card has details of the scam with a message that the Canada Revenue Agency does not accept payments with gift cards. Police also remind us to never give out any personal information over the phone. If you've been the victim of this or any other online scam, to contact Lethbridge Police right away at 403-328-4444. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's former Principal Secretary Gerald Butts gave his version of events surrounding the SNC-Lavalin affair late yesterday. He says the potential of job losses at the company was a problem that needed to be addressed, and there was not a lot of pressure applied to former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould.
The fact that the company involved employs so many people across the country heightened the public importance of the matter. That was the entirety of our advice to the Attorney General, which we made clear she was free to accept or not. We also made clear that if the Attorney General accepted our proposal and took external advice, she was equally free to reject or accept that advice. It was not about second-guessing the decision. It was about ensuring that the Attorney General was making her decision with the absolute best evidence possible.
Various MPs on Parliament Hill reacted to the Butts testimony at the Justice Committee hearing. The Liberals say they found Butts to be quite credible. MPs from other parties did not.
Mr. Butts today testified on points of time that Jody Wilson-Raybould said she could not testify on. And then when we put forth the motion, when Murray put forth the motion to have her come back and testify again, the Liberal members of the committee decided, well, we've heard enough. Nothing to see here. Nothing new can come of it. And I think that's atrocious. I think Canadians want to hear the entire story, especially given that Mr. Butts' entire testimony was completely opposite of what Jody Wilson-Raybould said, especially on when dealing with the staff of the Prime Minister's office. We still need to hear from Jody Wilson-Raybould because regardless of whether or not you believe her now or not believe her, the reality is there is stark contradictions, and one of them isn't telling the full story. And we need to find out which one it is.
The picture they're trying to portray to Canadians is, this sad mistake of, emotions, that maybe they just misunderstood each other. Well, Ms. Wilson-Raybould was clear. She was not misunderstanding. She named names, she named dates, she named moments when she said inappropriate pressure was being made.
Canadians believe Madam Wilson-Raybould for a reason. Her testimony was credible, was thoughtful, was detailed, precise. What we heard today from Mr. Butts in no way addresses the key questions. In no way his responses where he didn't know about the vital information. In no way does he actually satisfy the concerns that are raised. More than ever, in fact, points to the necessity of having a public inquiry. Canadians want to get to the bottom of what's going on.
Conservative leader Andrew Scheer says nothing has changed after yesterday's testimony by the PM's former Principal Secretary, Gerald Butts. Scheer says an apology by the Prime Minister now would be insincere.
He has not been able to contradict or refute any of the allegations that were made against him. So it's clear that he has validated in that respect the accusation that a sustained, coordinated, and unwanted campaign to politically interfere with an independent court process was conducted by Justin Trudeau and his key advisors. That is completely unacceptable. They continued over a long period of time to put pressure on Ms. Wilson-Raybould to interfere politically in a criminal case. We don't want to live in the kind of country where powerful corporations, powerful people can get different treatment under the law. The corruption goes to the heart of this Liberal government, right to Justin Trudeau, and he refuses to accept any kind of responsibility. We find out in the last day that he's considering making an apology. He's got a focus group whether or not he should apologize to Canadians. That is so insincere.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he's learned many lessons from a cabinet controversy that has rocked his government. Trudeau, however, says he's still not apologizing.
One of the things central to my leadership is fostering an environment where my ministers, caucus, and staff feel comfortable coming to me when they have concerns. Indeed, I expect them to do so. In Ms. Wilson-Raybould's case, she did not come to me, and I wish she had. Because if it's a real relationship and if we truly are a team, we can always acknowledge when we need to make adjustments. Things won't always be perfect, but there should remain a constant level of openness and dialogue.
Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei Technologies, arrived at a BC Supreme Court in Vancouver. Her defense lawyer raised concerns about political motivations in her case. The executive was arrested in December at Vancouver's airport at the request of U.S. authorities. Canada announced last week that it intends to proceed with the extradition. Many Canadians are concerned about how much of a presence Chinese telecommunications company Huawei has in our country. Is there a threat to national security? Christian Leuprecht is a security expert and a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada. He says we need to be careful how much access we grant Huawei.
It is important for us to be aware that China is playing aggressively in this arena. And so this is why the conversation about Huawei is just one part of a much broader conversation that we ultimately need to have in Canada about what sort of activities are we prepared to tolerate and what sort of vulnerabilities are we prepared to have, and to what extent do we want to safeguard around this type of leverage, exploitation, and potential vulnerabilities.
Catch my full interview with Mr. Leuprecht discussing Canadian security issues coming up in the second half of our show. Alabama's Lee County Sheriff Jay Jones says the search for missing people after a deadly tornado is over. More than 100 homes were badly damaged, and the death toll remains at 23, with 4 people still in critical condition.
As we have announced in previous briefings, we have been concentrating our efforts on the search and rescue. And in particular, you may recall that we had 7, possibly 8 individuals who were unaccounted for in the area most affected. I'm very pleased to announce that after a joint effort between the Lee County Sheriff's Office Investigations Unit and the SBI, State Bureau of Investigation of the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, we are now confident we have accounted for all of the individuals that we had unaccounted for. So that number is down to 0.
As far as the state totals are concerned, we're going to have 11 tornadoes from this event. We're looking at a 12th one. I think the Tallahassee office is going to go out again today and reassess some areas just south of here. The total track for this F4 tornado is going to be about 70 miles as it went into Georgia.
The power companies indicated that approximately 116 homes were directly affected as far as that cannot receive power, and it would be somewhere within that number that were completely destroyed.
A minister and a coroner held 17 separate meetings with the relatives of the 23 people who died in the weekend tornado in Alabama.
Our church family, teachers, students that died, neighbors died, co-workers, death. We met with all of the families. They were in our sanctuary. They all gathered in our sanctuary, those families. We had rooms set aside when Bill Harris, the coroner, came in. I stayed with Bill as we spoke with each of the family members. I didn't say anything. I was just there. I was basically there with Bill. It was surreal. It was sacred, if I can use that term, weighty. It was. There wasn't any hilarity. There was nobody laughing. We don't know how they feel, and there's no way that we can identify with them totally and completely. But we can come alongside and sit with them, and we can feel their pain and do what we can to kind of just be a presence, a ministry of presence.
Jeopardy host Alex Trebek says he's been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He made the announcement in a recent YouTube video.
Now, just like 50,000 other people in the United States each year, This week, I was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Now, normally, the prognosis for this is not very encouraging, but I'm going to fight this, and I'm going to keep working, and with the love and support of my family and friends, and with the help of your prayers also, I plan to beat the low survival rate statistics for this disease. Truth told, I have to, because under the terms of my contract, I have to host Jeopardy for 3 more years.
Trebek became an American citizen in 1998 and has won many Emmy Awards as host of Jeopardy! Alex Trebek and his wife Jean have 2 children. Yesterday marked the beginning of the Christian season of Lent. For Christians, Lent represents the 40 days Jesus fasted in the desert as he was tempted by Satan. BCN's Loris Alexander spoke with the Evangelical Free Church of Lethbridge about the significance of the 40 days leading up to Easter or Resurrection Sunday.
The period of Lent is seen as a time of observance and preparation for the celebration of the death and resurrection of Jesus at Easter.
The reason that I observe it is to help me understand more of the sacrifice that Christ made, enter into that experience a bit more, and then the purpose again is that when Easter comes, there's more of a celebration of the new life and the resurrection that comes along with that.
The 40 days represents the time Jesus spent in the wilderness, enduring the temptation of Satan and preparing to begin his ministry.
When I think of 40 days, immediately I think of Jesus being led into the wilderness for 40 days. Right after his baptism, the Spirit led him out into the wilderness. That's where he was tempted. He endured those temptations. He fasted, he prayed during that time as well.
The number 40 appears 146 times in the Bible.
So there's something significant about 40, and I don't know the biblical numerology or things like that specifically, but what I notice that comes out of those times is always this rebirth. So 40 days, Jesus was in the wilderness, and then he kind of launched his ministry. It was sort of launched as baptism, but really in terms of interacting with people and announcing the good news of the kingdom that started after those 40 days.
For Pamela, Lent is a deeper relationship with Christ.
I think a big thing that I learn in the practice of Lent really comes just from relationship with Christ.
She says Lent eliminates distractions in those 40 days, which allows her to live out the lessons learned for the rest of the year.
There might have been things that he's been speaking to me about already that in the 40 days I become more cognizant of because I'm not as distracted. And then the trickle-down effect throughout the year is that lesson that needed to take root in me takes root over those 40 days, and then I tend to live that out.
Lent affords an opportunity to reinforce the significance of Christ's work. For Bridge City News, I'm Loris Alexander.
It was a nice mild day in the Windy City today, and the mercury will be climbing even further. Complete weather details are coming up. We've been using lots of windshield wiper fluid as the meltdown continues. Tonight, just a few clouds developing with a low near -8. Sunny and mild again tomorrow with a high near +1. Lots of sunshine again at 1 degree on Saturday. Slightly warmer on Sunday with a high expected near 2 degrees. Monday mainly sunny with a high near 3. Even warmer on Tuesday under a partly cloudy sky and a high near 7. Expect 6 degrees under a mainly cloudy sky on Wednesday. Checking the almanac, the average high for this time of year is 4 and an average low of -8. The highest temperature on the state was recorded in 2005 at 18 degrees, and the record low was -34 in 1951. Sunrise was at 7:03, sunset at 6:22. Let's have a look at how tomorrow's shaping up across the country now. A mixture of sun and cloud for Vancouver and high of 7, mainly cloudy and 8 degrees for Victoria. Periods of snow is expected and -5 for Calgary on Friday. Pretty much the same picture in Edmonton. Lots of sunshine at -3 for Regina. Sunny as well for Saskatoon tomorrow at a high of -6. Expect a mixture of sun and cloud for Winnipeg and a high of -7. In the central part of the country, Toronto will be partly cloudy at -1. Ottawa will be mainly sunny at -3. Montreal will have sunshine at -3. In the Maritimes, Fredericton, New Brunswick will be sunny at -1. Halifax, Nova Scotia will have a few clouds at -1. Charlottetown, PEI will be sunny at -4. And in St. John's, Newfoundland, expect flurries at -6 degrees tomorrow. Alberta's Environment and Parks Minister Shannon Phillips is calling on Ottawa to protect Alberta's canola industry. The call comes after China banned canola imports from one of Canada's largest exporters, Richardson International, earlier this week. Phillips mentioned how China is an important market for southern Alberta producers. Phillips added that Ottawa needs to work hard to stand up for those jobs, livelihoods, and farm families who rely on the canola industry. Phillips said Richardson is expanding its operations in Lethbridge to the tune of $120 million. According to the Government of Alberta, Richardson International exports 30% of Alberta's total canola crop. About 70% of all Alberta agri-food exports to China are canola-related products. Chinese tech giant Huawei is challenging a U.S. law that would limit its American sales of telecom equipment based on security issues. The move comes as the company steps up efforts to preserve its access to global markets for next-generation communications. Huawei filed a lawsuit asking U.S. federal court to reject the claim as unconstitutional. Currently, the U.S. government or military is not being allowed to use any Huawei equipment. Canadian Natural Resources says the impact of low oil prices for Canadian oil pushed it into the red for the fourth quarter. It says it lost $776 million. Now that compares with a profit of $396 million a year ago. On an adjusted basis, it says it lost $255 million or 21 cents per share. That fell well short of what analysts expected of a 14-cent profit. The company, however, raised its quarterly dividend to 37.5 cents per share after reporting $2.59 billion profit for the full year. The Transportation Safety Board says the number of railway accidents has increased by 7% in Canada. There were 1,170 railway accidents last year. That's up by 80 from 2017. Fortunately, fatalities decreased to 57 from 76 a year earlier, but the number of serious injuries rose from 65 to 91. It was mainly due to events at crossings. Accidents involving dangerous goods increased 9% to 125, with 6 resulting in the release of dangerous materials. Users of social media around the world have expressed concerns about privacy issues when it comes to Facebook. The social media analyst says when it comes to privacy, all Facebook is doing right now is paying lip service.
I think this was a business move by Facebook yesterday. This was not a pivot to privacy. This was trying to open up whole new lines of business around messaging, payments, and candidly trying to co-opt the whole privacy regulation efforts that are going on so they don't get regulated or broken up. At the same time, they're certainly paying a lot of lip service to privacy, and that's probably what's even more concerning to me is how much they're not actually changing their true underlying privacy practices tied to their business model of selling personal data. The Facebook news feed and the underlying social network is not going away, and he didn't talk about greater privacy there. He talked about privacy around messaging, which again is something that's really, you know, the horse is already out of the barn on that one, or that's happening already. They're catching up, if you will. And also, you might have noticed that Zuckerberg talked quite a bit about payments, which is one of the fastest growing businesses in the world today, and it's clearly something, I think he mentioned it over 5 times in his blog post. They are clearly trying to open up these new avenues, and nobody wants to send money on a service that doesn't have at least some basic privacy and encryption. Facebook and Zuckerberg have invented this problem, and it's also, you know, a company he unilaterally controls. So looking to him to lead the way on privacy and figure these problems out for us is really a fool's errand.
Now here's a look at today's markets. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's former Principal Secretary, Gerald Butts, gave his version of events surrounding the SNC-Lavalin affair. He says the potential of job losses at the company was a problem that needed to be addressed, and there was not a lot of pressure applied to former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould. Many on the Hill disagreed. Tory leader Andrew Scheer says the Prime Minister still needs to step down, and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says Canadians deserve a public inquiry. The federal carbon tax has been a killer to Alberta businesses. Up next, I chat with a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute who has details of a new paper entitled Carbon Pricing in Alberta. That interview is coming up next. But first, here's a look what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News community calendar. Join the Lethbridge Community Band Society as they celebrate Music from the Silver Screen, taking place Saturday, March 9th at College Drive Community Church in Lethbridge, beginning at 7 p.m. Conducted by Josh Davies, this concert will feature a variety of brass instruments not often seen in traditional North American concert settings. The performance includes music from King Kong, Braveheart, Apollo 13, and much more. Tickets are $15 and children 12 and under are free. Purchase yours today at CASA or online at lcbs.yapcity.com. Celebrate Recovery is a Christ-centered recovery program for any hurt, hang-up, and habit. This group meets Friday nights at the Park Meadows Baptist Church. The evening begins at 6 p.m. with supper and follows with an opportunity to share and connect with others in small groups. For more information, visit celebraterecovery.ca. Big Brothers Big Sisters in Lethbridge is searching for volunteers to mentor children and youth in their various programs. Volunteers commit anywhere from 1 hour a week to 1 full year. They have many kids on their wait lists that are looking for a big brother or sister. Make a difference in a child's life and start something big. For more information, call 403-328-9355 or email info.leth@bigbrothersbigsisters.ca. And that's your Bridge City News community calendar.
Just mention the words carbon tax and watch temperatures rise on both sides of the debate. The federal government thinks it's the cat's meow, while a number of provinces believe it's the mark of the beast. We're going to wade into it a little bit further with Robert Murphy, who is a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute and has a doctorate in economics. Robert has written a paper called Carbon Pricing in Alberta. Bob, welcome to Bridge City News.
Thanks for having me, Hal. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, can you first of all explain to our viewers how a carbon tax is supposed to work theoretically?
Well, sure. So the idea, of course, is that there's problems that come from emission of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide in particular, that the market economy is not taking into account. So when people decide how much gasoline to buy, what kind of car to buy, they're not taking into account, so the theory goes, their actions on the rest of humanity through the mechanism of climate change. So a carbon tax, if it's correctly calibrated, the idea is that that will give people the negative feedback they need in order to make the socially correct decisions, taking everything into account. So that's the textbook theory of what a carbon tax is supposed to do in this context.
In theory, then, carbon-emitting businesses will find ways to reduce carbon output in order to pay less in carbon taxes, which will hopefully reduce their carbon footprint?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Hal. So that's the theory. And the reason some economists think a carbon tax is the best way to deal with the problem of climate change is that the government's not ordering businesses to cut back in a certain way. It's not telling which particular companies how much they need to cut back. It's just putting a, quote, price on carbon and then letting everybody adjust, just like in the normal market. If oil gets more expensive, you just let people respond to the price accordingly, and each person can cut back the way he or she thinks is appropriate for their household or business. So you're right. The idea of this is like it's supposed to be like a decentralized mechanism. But again, they're saying we need to put this tax in place because the market's not taking into account climate change.
Now, you say there's something happening they'll refer to as leakage. What is that all about?
Sure. So the problem here, and what the study was really getting at, is to say that whether you think that a carbon tax is a good approach to dealing with climate change or not, it really doesn't make sense to do it just at the provincial level. So that was, I think, one of the main points of the study. And the specific problem, as you say, Hale, is this thing called leakage. And so the idea here is, let me just exaggerate it just so you get the point. Imagine the Alberta government just put in place a really draconian carbon tax, like thousands of dollars a ton, and they enforced it, very, very strictly. So what would happen over time is just all the businesses and households would just move out of Alberta and they would go to other jurisdictions. And so that's what's meant by leakage. In other words, the emissions aren't really stopped. They just leak elsewhere to other jurisdictions. So global emissions wouldn't actually go down that much. Alberta emissions might go way down in that scenario I just described, but they would just go up elsewhere. And so if the point is to minimize global climate change, just displacing emissions out of the province of Alberta elsewhere obviously just means Alberta suffers economically, and it doesn't even do that much to address climate change. So that problem of leakage is bigger the smaller the jurisdiction. So even at the federal level, you'd have it, but it's really pronounced at like the provincial level.
Now, part of the problem seems to be that if we spend all of this money to reduce emissions, but our economic competitors and other nations are not, then do we really remain competitive? You know, many of those countries like China and India producing far more emissions than we are. Are we really making much of a difference, Bob?
Well, you're exactly right, Hal, and that's just another way of seeing this problem of leakage. So again, yes, if the Alberta policymakers, if they think, oh, we want to do our part, and they really ramp up taxes and other mandates and penalties on emissions, they could reduce emissions in Alberta, and that, of course, makes electricity more expensive, gasoline more expensive for people living in Alberta. But you're right, that doesn't do that much to fight the global problem of climate change because other countries, governments, they're not cracking down nearly as much. And what's really perverse is if a particular manufacturing operation, let's say, moves out of Canada and goes to China, well, in general, to produce the same amount of goods, they're going to emit more tons of CO2 just because the techniques they use over there happen to be less efficient in terms of emissions. And so you could get a perverse result where in certain cases it might actually increase emissions even though the local jurisdiction in Canada thinks they're, quote, doing the right thing.
Now, in the 2018-2019 fiscal, Alberta's carbon levy is expected to raise $1.4 billion. That money is coming from business owners and consumers, with a further scheduled increase to $50 per ton in 2022. That'll increase the burden of the carbon tax on businesses and households. So how are the governments using the tax revenue coming in from this?
So the CLP, the Climate Leadership Plan, it's using the revenue in three main ways. So these are rough figures, of course, but about a third of it's going to try to reduce other types of taxes. Another third's going for rebates, and another third is devoted to what we could call green energy projects, things to try to get businesses to convert over to alternative energies, things like that. And so the problem is, though, that even on its own terms, that this is one of the things that we get across in the study, if you are going to have a carbon tax, then what you want to do is just refund the money to citizens, and you don't want to have the government spend it on other programs. In other words, that's redundant. The whole point of the carbon tax is to decentralize the cutbacks, not to have the government on top of that then give mandates or to subsidize wind and solar and things like that. Because again, that's defeating the whole purpose.
So are the green energy projects funded by the carbon tax creating jobs and helping to stimulate the economy?
Well, they certainly create jobs in the sectors that are receiving the money, but then on the flip side, the areas that are being taxed are seeing job shrinkage. Okay, so I wouldn't say that the government's not creating jobs on net, especially in the long run, if they levy a tax on some sectors of the economy and then subsidize other ones.
Now, with all of the money which is being collected, how much of a dent are we really putting into climate change?
Again, here we come back to the problem that you face trying to address it at the Canadian level, let alone at the level of Alberta. So Canada by itself, the figures I checked, it's something like 1.6 or 1.5% of total global emissions. And so, of course, Alberta, just the province, their emissions are obviously even smaller than that. And so in the grand scheme, and it's even worse in terms of if you ask, okay, from now through, let's say, the year 2100, if things progress the way people project, what percentage of those new emissions going forward is going to be accounted for by businesses in Canada or even in Alberta, let alone? Obviously, it's going to be a very minuscule thing. So even if Canada tomorrow went to zero emissions, in the grand scheme, that wouldn't make much of a difference, let alone the small changes that are coming in place from modest carbon taxes. So the quick answer to your question is it's causing a lot of economic pain without very much to show for it, just because, again, Canada is such a small player and this problem of leakage.
Yeah, where's the return on investment here, right? The Alberta Climate Leadership Plan does have quarterly rebates to residents who qualify with lower incomes. How effective has that approach really been?
Okay, so here again, you have a trade-off. So obviously, part of the problem or the cost, if you will, of a carbon tax is it makes electricity and transportation more expensive, and that's going to tend to burden lower-income people the most, right? If electricity gets 20% more expensive, poor households suffer more than rich ones do, obviously. And so I applaud the the motivation to say, hey, let's take some of this incoming revenue and give it as rebates to poorer households. So that certainly makes sense. But the problem is, in terms of economic efficiency, what you want to do is to reduce the taxes elsewhere in order to stimulate growth. And so just giving people lump sum checks, that doesn't give them the incentive to work more or to save more. And so that's one of the problems. That if you are going to use revenue to reduce the burden on the citizens, just giving them fixed checks, that's actually the least efficient way to do it.
So, Bob, your study shows that it would be better economically if Alberta simply reduced corporate income tax rates by the amount of carbon tax revenue coming in. Can you explain that?
Sure. So there again, this is standard results in the literature, that a lot of the people who are for a carbon tax, if the critics will say, well, gee, won't this hurt the economy? And they'll say, oh, well, no, if we do it right, if we take the revenues and we reduce corporate income taxes, then maybe the economy can continue to grow and we won't slow economic growth. And so my point is, there's not enough money to go around. That yes, the way you can make it so the economy doesn't slow too much is to use the new carbon tax revenues to cut the most damaging of other taxes, namely like the corporate income tax and other income taxes. So that if all you wanted to do was to not have GDP growth slow, you could do that. But then that means there's no money left over to help poor households who are struggling with higher energy prices. But if you try to use the money to help the poor households, then there's not money left to do the corporate income tax cuts. So the point is, you're going to have to choose who's going to get hurt. And either way, bad things happen if you impose a new carbon tax. And I think that, the proponents need to admit that.
So if Alberta and Canada continue to have a tax on carbon, your paper suggests it would be better to apply the tax right across Alberta, not just to carbon emitters. And would this do less damage to the economy?
Well, I think maybe what you read in the part of the study there is, well, what I was saying in the conclusion is I was trying to give recommendations to policymakers. And what I was saying is, one thing would just be to get rid of the Alberta carbon tax altogether, but especially in the context of if the federal government is going to have a standard, a baseline, and say that the provinces need to have a level of this much, that it would be silly for Alberta to have it above that level, right? So in other words, there's no reason for Alberta to have a carbon tax higher than what's being applied in the other provinces, because again, you get this problem of leakage. In the grand scheme, that's not going to do anything except punish Alberta businesses.
We've got the provincial election coming up here in Alberta this spring. We've got the federal election in October, and Justin Trudeau and the Liberals are in a bit of disarray right now with the SNC-Lavalin affair. If we see changes in government provincially and federally, will we likely say goodbye to the carbon tax?
Well, again, it's hard to predict the politics, and so I was mostly focusing on the economics, but you're right. I think some people, there's an argument to say, hey, let's have the Alberta, the province of Alberta impose our own carbon tax, because then under the current structure, we at least get a say in how the revenues are used. Whereas if the feds come in and do it, they're going to be the ones in control of the rebate. But what you're talking about, I think, is a school of thought from the other side saying it would be silly for us to go ahead and get the machinery up and tax everyone in Alberta if at the federal level all that goes away, because the country's mood changes and there's different electoral outcomes. And so it would be, again, what really would make no sense is if Alberta has a real stiff carbon tax and then the rest of Canada, it's in patches, because that does nothing. It just means certain provinces are getting hit with these arbitrarily high energy prices and businesses go elsewhere. So global emissions aren't really affected that much.
I talked to a lot of small business owners, Bob, that run their businesses across southwestern Alberta, and they've been hit hard by the carbon tax since the NDP brought it in, with the Trudeau Liberals here. So how are businesses really going to adjust, and what impact will it have on the economy if all of a sudden there is no carbon tax? Just more money in their pockets, they can hire more people, stimulate the economy?
Sure. And so here, again, I want to remind people, the whole reason we're having this discussion, the reason that businesses use electricity right now that's produced partly from fossil fuel sources, the reason so many vehicles rely on conventional gasoline is that that's cheaper and more effective, more convenient than strictly renewable or zero emission energy sources. So if the government through taxing and mandates is going to force businesses and households to switch, that has a cost. So going the other way, if you get rid of that tax and get rid of those mandates, then that means there's more real resources available to increase production. So the way you would see that is, yes, they would have more income left over. They would hire more. There'd be faster job growth. That's what you would see. But ultimately, it's just saying letting people create electricity and transportation in the most economically sensible fashion. That's what happens when the government sort of keeps its hands off and lets people make their own decisions.
Robert Murphy is a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute. Thanks a lot for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Hal.
Cybersecurity is becoming more and more of a need in today's quickly changing world. Today's guest recently wrote an article published in the National Post entitled, "Why Banning Huawei is Just One of a Series of Steps Canada Needs to Take to Defend Itself." Christian Leuprecht is a security expert and a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Christian, welcome to Bridge City News.
Hello.
The Huawei controversy has created a lot of headlines, but I do wonder if the average Canadian really cares. They think to themselves, just a telecommunications company, what's the big deal? Can you explain how Huawei can pose a real threat to Canada's national security?
So I think this is generally the challenge that we have with anything in cyberspace and with regards to networks, data, cybersecurity in particular, that on the one hand, people have a relatively poor understanding of how that space works. It's a little bit like getting into your car. You don't understand exactly how the engine works. You just get in and it sort of runs. And then there's the Hollywood effect, where the understanding that people think they do have comes from movies that really convey a very adulterated version of how things actually work. And so you put those together, and it becomes very difficult to convey to people how the real world actually works on this particular issue. So let me take a step back and explain why, in particular, the Huawei issue is so controversial. You have to understand the basic structure of the internet, which is sort of a hierarchical structure of switches. And these switches direct essentially traffic and flow of traffic. And so there are only so many high-level switches within the network, and only so many, for instance, in North America. And so the more of the traffic you can see, the more of the traffic you can divert, the more of the traffic you can try to decrypt. And even if the traffic is encrypted, simply seeing the traffic patterns provides a significant amount of intelligence. And so the concern here is that whoever provides equipment for those top level switches could ostensibly try to manipulate that equipment to their advantage. And so the debate here is on whether a company that is closely linked with a country that in some ways is a partner, in some ways is a collaborator, but in other ways is very much an adversary, as we can see on other policy issues with regards to China, whether we want to give that sort of company unfettered access to the most critical parts of our critical communications infrastructure.
You know, it's very interesting to note as well, Christian, that China does not allow any foreign companies to operate in its own telecommunication infrastructure networks. How do you respond to that?
So this is one of the points that I have long made, that inherently trade, in particular in technology, should have reciprocity. And so why should we let a company compete in Canada where Canadian firms and other international firms cannot compete fairly in the same way on the Chinese market? But add to that the concerns around Huawei's behavior more broadly. So not only does it have a monopoly on the Chinese market, it receives upwards of $10 billion in subsidies a year, which means, of course, that companies that do not receive such subsidies have a harder time competing, because it means these subsidies can go into innovation, they can go into subsidizing some of the products that the company sells. But Huawei, of course, has a 30-year track record of poor competitive behavior, in particular when it comes to intellectual property. And in Canada, we've been recipients and we've suffered the consequence of that. Older viewers may remember a company called Nortel. Nortel Networks was, in the 1970s and 80s, the leading company in the world in providing said switches that I just talked about, a multi-billion-dollar global company. One of the first products that Huawei produced was essentially a Nortel switch that was reproduced down to the pages of the operating manual, instruction manual of that switch. And so it is, in particular in Canada, baffling to me that we would let a company that has built its own intellectual property and its international competitiveness on the backs of a Canadian multi-billion-dollar company that, as a result, effectively imploded and put thousands of people out of work, that we would let that sort of company then subsequently compete in an open and equitable fashion on the Canadian market.
Now, what about the actual cell phones themselves? If our citizens, politicians, and business people are using phones manufactured by a company controlled by China, what kind of risk does this really present?
So let's be clear. One of the reasons why, for instance, the telecommunications companies in Canada are lobbying hard against a ban on Huawei equipment in network infrastructure is that Huawei equipment is very good and it is very cost effective. And so we need to distinguish between different types of equipment. Yes, you run a certain risk with having a Huawei phone, but you run also a certain risk with having a Google Pixel phone that Google will keep track of your data in a way that, for instance, might be more difficult to do if you have a different type of product. And so those are probably manageable risks, but of course, anybody who buys a Huawei phone takes certain risks in that regard. The question is whether in the critical parts of our communications network infrastructure, we should allow equipment by a company that has not only the track record that I've laid out, but also a, shall we say, dubious relationship with Chinese authorities and with the Chinese government. And in Canada, in 2012, we already made the decision to ban certain types of Huawei equipment from critical Canadian government infrastructure. And so the question then is, how vulnerable are we prepared to leave our broader Canadian internet infrastructure to possible exploitation by an adversary, and to what extent do we want to mitigate those particular types of risks by either banning such equipment outright, or like Germany is looking to do, perhaps write procurement provisions in a way that makes it very difficult or impossible for certain companies to compete, such as those that don't operate in democratic systems, such as some of Huawei's competitors.
Now, I understand that intelligence sources say China has been actively mapping and analyzing the electrical grids and oil pipelines of Western nations. Should we be concerned about this?
So this is a standard procedure in the intelligence game, that you want to understand your competitors, your adversaries, where their possible vulnerabilities might lie in the case of a conflict. But certainly I think we should be, it's when you talk about threats, there are always two components. There's capability and there's intent. And so what China is demonstrating by having mapped these critical infrastructure systems is that it has the capability to map those systems. However, it has insisted, in particular Huawei has insisted, that it does not collaborate with Chinese intelligence. Of course, Chinese legislation requires all Chinese companies to collaborate with the government and its intelligence security services if called upon to do so. And so Huawei claims that no Trojan horses have ever been found in its network equipment that it provides. At the same time, of course, all this equipment has backdoors because, like your home computer, you need to update the software in that equipment. And so that means that while there's no intent today, perhaps, to cause vulnerability and exploitation within that critical infrastructure, that this can change overnight, and that these backdoors that are necessary in the equipment allow a hostile government potentially to exercise such intent in a very expeditious manner.
Now, Christian, some people argue banning Huawei would negatively affect trade with China, and welcoming Huawei into Canada would provide more competition and lower prices for consumers. How are you seeing it?
Yeah, sure. There's always costs and benefits to any policy and political decision in this regard. And so it is clear that a ban on Huawei, or perhaps not an outright ban on Huawei equipment network infrastructure, but perhaps certain restrictions, such as the ones we already have in place for government infrastructure, may well drive up costs, means perhaps a slower build out of the 5G network infrastructure. But I think the Canadian government also needs to show some resolution with regards to safeguarding the sovereign democratic decision-making capability of a constitutional rule of law government that is freely and fairly elected, which of course is not the case when it comes to the Chinese regime. And so we've already seen in current policy areas, such as, for instance, the extradition of Ms. Wang Zhu in Vancouver, the Huawei executive who's currently incarcerated or is being held, detained on request of extradition to the United States, that China is using multiple policy levers to try to change the government's minds. So now imagine if, in addition to the policy levers of political and economic levers, the Chinese government could now exploit vulnerabilities in our critical communications infrastructure in order to, for instance, slow internet traffic in Canada, cut off certain internet traffic, deliberately divert internet traffic, introduce malicious code and other vulnerabilities that might have economic and social consequences within Canada into our internet, in addition to the levers that it is already exercising. And so I would say that Canadian sovereignty is not discretionary, and that ultimately security policy is always a question of, it's kind of like buying insurance. How much coverage are you willing to buy, and how much are you willing to pay for that coverage? And my argument is here that this is an insurance coverage that ultimately Canada needs and wants to buy, because it is impossible or very difficult and costly to remove this type of equipment after the fact. And so we want to remove it from our infrastructure. So we need to, these are what's known as downstream constraints. And so we need to make the decision now as to how secure we want to be and what sort of safeguards we want to put in place.
With the theft of intellectual property and technology taking place more and more often, to what degree could this really be impacting the Canadian economy?
So there are repercussions for the potential repercussions for the Canadian economy, of course, in a couple of ways here. One is the ability of an adversary to manipulate Canadian networks and Canadian data or exploit those for hostile purposes. And of course, banning Huawei equipment or restricting it from infrastructure won't take out those vulnerabilities completely, because if you have a poorly built network, for instance, then you're still open to vulnerabilities. So there's many factors at work here. And it also then provides, having these vulnerabilities in your systems, more opportunity to leverage exploitation of commercial trade secrets, commercial espionage, intellectual property. At the same time, of course, it would allow an adversary to perhaps mount hostile attacks on entire sectors of Canadian prosperity and large Canadian companies or critical infrastructure sectors, whether that might be banking or electricity or pipelines or whatnot, as a way to try to change the government's mind. And so I think these are not the sort of vulnerabilities to which we want to expose ourselves if we value Canadian sovereignty and sovereign decision-making.
Christian, we hear reports that China is actually actively planting people into our educational, business, military, and political arenas in order to exert influence from the inside. Is this actually happening?
So this is what's known as the United Front activities. There's a number of things that have been written about, including a recent book with regards to Canada. It is not as widely known in Canada as, for instance, in Australia. China is not particularly shy about these activities. It is a deliberate, strategic effort and a long-term effort by China to obtain strategic trade secrets, political secrets, and to be able to leverage decision and influence making within countries. And so the broader issue of Huawei and Canadian critical communications infrastructure needs to be situated within these broader efforts by the Chinese regime. And these are efforts on which the current regime under Xi Jinping has very much doubled down and has made it quite public that they are fully committed to United Front activities in order to ensure China's competitiveness, both political, economic, as well as defense, intelligence, and security on the world stage. And so it is important for us to be aware that China is playing aggressively in this arena. And so this is why the conversation about Huawei is just one part of a much broader conversation that we ultimately need to have in Canada about what sort of activities are we prepared to tolerate and what sort of vulnerabilities are we prepared to have, and to what extent do we want to safeguard around this type of leverage, exploitation, and potential vulnerabilities within our broader Canadian society and infrastructure.
So, Christian, bottom line, what does the Canadian government need to do to bring proper security to our communications networks?
The government ultimately has an opportunity here to show resolve. We've seen efforts in light of triggered efforts by the Chinese government to change our minds on the Meng Wanzhou case. The government has been slow rolling a decision on Huawei. And I actually think the Canadian government will want to be aggressive here and show that if China thinks they need to play hardball, that we can do so too. Of course, the reason why the Chinese are so concerned about a decision with regards to Huawei is that it poses serious reputational risk to the company as a whole. There's likely other countries that would fall in line with Canada once such a decision were made. And so it closes off significant markets. It means that one of the reputational risks of a crown jewel of Chinese industry is damaged. But it also means that if the company can no longer compete in certain aspects, it will means the company sells less material. That contributes to the slowdown of the Chinese economy, and that then contributes to undermining some of the legitimacy of the Chinese regime. And so I think Canada has an opportunity here to show resolve and to both make a decision on this critical issue while at the same time signaling very clearly to the current regime in Beijing that it is not open to being extorted in terms of our policy and political decision-making processes.
Christian Leukprecht is a security expert and a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Thanks a lot for joining me today from Ottawa, Ontario.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, be safe, and have a great night.